Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I am Dareen Khalifa, a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group, and I'll be moderating the conversation within the next 45 minutes or so. As someone who's been following Syria myself for the past 8 years, I know how difficult it is to predict anything related to this conflict. Syria has been surprising us all in unimaginable ways for the past 10 years. But today, and after over 10 years of war, the parties to the conflict are deadlocked in an uneasy standoff. This has counterintuitively led to a stalemate and a reduction in levels of violence. That said, any changes in the balance of power could lead to catastrophic outcomes, as we've seen before. The notion of regime change has dissipated, yet Assad's ambitions to regain every inch of the country have also seemed to become even more far-fetched, at least as long as the US and Turkey remain put in Syria. Assad has regained control over almost 70% of the country, including major cities, yet lost control over 80% of its natural resources, including water, oil, gas, and wheat. Damascus remains a pariah in most Western countries, has little friends in the Middle East, and is under tight economic sanctions from Western countries in the EU. Throughout the last few days, many of us have been asking about the future of Syria, but put bluntly, there's been a lot of questions about the future of the regime itself. And if European and Arab countries would or should start normalizing relations with Damascus. I'm joined today by two esteemed panelists, Special Envoy Gareth Patterson, who unfortunately could not be here in person and is joining us virtually. Mr. Patterson has been the UN Special Envoy to Syria since 2018. He's an astute politician and brilliant diplomat with an impossible job, but has nevertheless managed to maintain positive relations to all parties to the conflict. He remarkably also has been relentless in trying to keep the Syrian peace process alive. We're also joined by Mr. Stefano Ravignan, and I apologize for butchering your name. Mr. Ravignan is the Italian Special Envoy for the Syrian conflict. He has also been following Syria closely from his previous position based out of Moscow. Without further ado, I'll start by asking Mr. Patterson, and I'll put you on the spot by asking you a blunt question. Is the Constitutional Committee dead? The committee has been the primary focus of the peace process for quite a bit of time now. Do you think that should continue to be the case? Or should we call spade a spade and move on? If not, then what other reciprocal processes do you envision? Mr. Patterson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dareen. I hope you can hear me well.
We can.
Very good. Let me first start by saying that I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person together with you. Rome is really my favorite city, so I would have loved to be there. But thank you still for inviting me and for being able to participate today. I think, Dareen, that you had an excellent introduction outlining all the challenges. And I think, if we take your introduction as the background, then of course you will understand that the work of the Syrian Constitutional Committee cannot solve the Syrian crisis by itself. And I think, Dareen, as you know, that has been my opinion from day number one, that the Constitutional Committee could, if it's handled in the correct manner, it could be a door opener to the wider process. But the committee on its own can, of course, not resolve the conflict. But that being said, the Constitutional Committee has some positive aspects. First and foremost, it's the only place where the two sides still meet and discuss. As you know, we have 50 members nominated by the Syrian government. We have 50 members nominated by the Syrian opposition, and we have 50 members from the so-called middle third or civil society. Then within those 150, we have 50 members from each group who forms a sort of a drafting committee. We have so far, as you know, have had 6 meetings, and I have been very clear, you know, in my statements, public statements, and also in my briefings to the Security Council, and of course, you know, in my dialogue with the two parties, that the committee has not really delivered on its promise. We made some progress in the last meeting of the drafting body, in the 6th meeting. You know, then we were able to have draft constitutional text for the first time being put on the table. And we had some exchanges, but what I'm now focusing on is the need to get the parties to engage seriously in what I call a productive textual drafting process. And what we need is basically what we have already agreed upon with the terms of reference that we negotiated more than 2 years ago, and that is that the committee should work continuously and expeditiously to produce results and continued progress. So if I may add to this, Darine, that of course, you know, this is one important aspect of the work that we are doing, but I'm also exploring other avenues, other ways that we can hopefully start to address other issues that are sort of hampering progress. Because, you know, as you alluded to, the crisis in Syria is still so deep. In my opinion, it's an international crisis of the first order, and it's a crisis that cannot be easily contained. And as you said, if it is, you know, if it breaks down the relative calm that we are having now, it could have disastrous consequences. So I have some ideas on how we can move forward on this that I have presented to the Security Council and to the parties. I don't know if you like me to mention that now or if you like to move on.
Thank you so much, Gareth. I'm going to come back to that. But since you mentioned the two parties, I'm going to ask you the question I always ask you every time we meet. And I probably have asked Stefan the same questions in the past. What about the other parties not included in the peace process? Today, we have 2 out of 3 of the major parties in Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that controls northern western Syria, and the Kurdish-led YPG in the northeast that are completely excluded from the process. Do you envision a way, if any, to start thinking of creative ways to include these parts of Syria that are currently excluded?
Thanks, Darina. I think you know my answer too, and that is that when it comes to HDF, as you know, it's a UN-listed terrorist group, and as so, of course, it's excluded from any participation in the political process. When it comes to the SDF, the situation, as you know, is more complex. I think we all agree that obviously, you know, the Kurdish element will have to be a part of the solution to the crisis. We will never be able to find a solution without the Northeast being part of that solution. And you will have noticed yourself that there are extensive contacts between the SDF and Moscow and also between the SDF and Damascus. My hope is that it will be possible to find a way out of this that will enable us to address all the key issues that needs to be addressed in finding a solution also to the challenges in the Northeast. But as you rightly said, you know, in my mandate in Security Council Resolution 2254, they are sort of not mentioned as one of the parties that I should include in the political process. And as you know, 2254 is indeed my mandate and what I have to relate to.
Thank you so much, Gareth. Stefano, turning to you. Let's assume for the sake of this conversation that there's a joint EU position. Do you think that the EU or European countries would or should start contemplating the idea of resuming diplomatic ties with Damascus?
Well, let's say, first of all, that I'm relatively new in this task, so I'm still optimistic. Maybe that's why.
We're not giving you a pass, though. Huh? We're not giving you a pass. You still need to answer.
I feel, as we have so many contacts among Europeans, including recently, yesterday and the day before, Europe really can make the difference in this stalemate situation. Of course, unity of European position makes the difference. I mean, as single countries, we are all aware that we are not capable of really changing and influencing the situation. Of course, unity should be always renewed. I mean, there should be a frank discussion on the reality, because the reality of Syria is moving. From outside, let's say, for non-diplomats, sometimes the idea is that there's a kind of long-standing stalemate, which is not the case. I would say, unfortunately, in this situation, currently we have an economic crisis which is really deep, much worse than probably during the period of the, let's say, conflict time. There's an institutional framework which is collapsing. So in such a situation, I think Europe could really probably also make, I mean, we are the first donor in terms of humanitarian aid. We could capitalize on this role probably a bit better. In terms of normalizing, I would exclude. I mean, it's impossible to imagine normalization with a regime now, but I guess before, I mean, between zero and normalization, there's a word. I mean, so to engage in activities like nowadays we talk a lot about early recovery. Early recovery means working in a different way on humanitarian aid with a perspective, even in touch, in contact with the local authorities. I mean, in municipalities and things. It doesn't mean normalizing. It means probably shifting a bit the attention and putting a perspective in what we are doing. But normalization as such, let's say, come back and as things didn't happen, I would exclude as of now.
All right. I think that answers many questions that have been raised the last few days about potential normalization. Well, just to follow up on that, the EU official position is towards pouring reconstruction money in Syria, is that no reconstruction money absent concrete, irreversible steps towards the achievement of Security Council Resolution 2254. That sounds great, but what does it actually mean? In concrete terms.
Let's say the difference, or better, the notion of early recovery is still under discussion as such. As you know, it's part of the last resolution on cross-border, the last cross-border resolution. And now there's a lot of discussion among Europeans, the Americans and so on, how to best define the limits of this early recovery. In general, I would say that early recovery is what doesn't touch political level. So it means we are shifting from the life-saving to projects which are giving perspective in terms of economic activities, of livelihoods, improving the conditions for the people without touching on the political sphere, or as someone would say, benefiting or minimizing the benefit for the regime. Of course, it's not an easy distinction line, I understand it perfectly, but it's already a step forward, I think, in the assistance we are providing to Syria. Understanding that all these activities should be finalized. I mean, it's after 10 years, you cannot just imagine the classical humanitarian aid, although it's still needed. So in a sense, it's important not to distract resources and forget about humanitarian needs, which are necessary, but give the idea that we can intervene in the country in a more structured and structural way, I would say.
Thank you. Gareth, back to you, and I'm going to ask you this question rather bluntly. Do you think European and Arab willingness to expand on early recovery, and in the case of some Arab countries, resume diplomatic ties, absent concrete asks from Damascus, Do you think it's forfeiting leverage? Do you think it undermines the political process?
Listen, Doreen, I think it's important that we sit down and we try to, as you did at the very beginning, that we try to realistically assess what the situation is. And I think, you know, there is no, from what I'm picking up from everyone, as I think you also said in your introduction, there is an acceptance that regime change is not an option. And I think just as importantly, there is also the acceptance that no one can dictate the outcome of this conflict. You know, the government in Damascus cannot, the opposition obviously cannot, Russia cannot, Iran cannot, Turkey cannot, and United States cannot. So if we want to move, you know, the disaster that we still see unfolding in Syria, if we want to move that process forward, we need to start thinking about new kinds of initiatives. We need to try something new, something that we haven't been doing during the last 10 years. And I think that should be an approach that takes these realities into, you know, that we accept the realities that are there, but that we still, you know, keep the vision that is still there in the Security Council Resolution 2254, you know, the aspiration to meet, that we need to meet the aspiration of the Syrian people and to restore Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity and unity. But to be able to do that, I think we need to sit down seriously and we need to have, you know, what I call sort of, you know, both sides, which is, you know, it's not only two sides, but let's put it like this. We need the Europeans, we need the Americans, we need the Arabs and Turkey to sit down on one side and to identify what are the issues that are most important to them. Where do they think that Damascus needs to change? And then we need to see from Damascus, from Moscow, from Tehran, that they sit down and they identify areas where they believe things can change and what they will ask from the other side. And of course, then also the Arabs, the Europeans, and the Americans, they need to do the same. So what I'm asking for is what I call, you know, reciprocal steps. That could be, they could be different kinds of steps. That needs to be obviously defined with precision. It needs to be verifiable. And hopefully by doing that, we could start to build a little bit of trust. And I think, you know, the discussion about normalization or not is, you know, that's obviously up to, you know, the Arabs, it's up to the Europeans. But I think it's important that we realize that, you know, for instance, Syria back in the Arab League is not going to change anything when it comes to the situation on the ground. Today, 9 out of 10 Syrians are living in poverty. More than 13 million people is in dire need of humanitarian assistance. The country is divided into at least 3 different areas. And of course, on top of that, we have 5 different armies operating within the Syrian territory. All of this can only change if we sit down and we seriously discuss the different challenges and try to build a little bit of trust. In my opinion, Doreen, the differences between the key international players are today less than they were before. There is still a deep, deep mistrust. Let's not, you know, let's be honest about that. But we saw during the, you know, the summer, we saw the passing of the Security Council Resolution 2585 about early recovery, resilience, cross-border and cross-line operations, an important cooperation between Russia and the United States. And it is my hope that we could build on that understanding in the humanitarian field and move on also to the political arena. Because if we don't do that, the most realistic scenario today is not only a continuation of the status quo, but a continued disaster in Syria that would have also a dramatic impact on the region, in Turkey, in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. And we all know that also the situation in Idlib, is not stable with 1.5 million IDPs, and the consequences that would have if we saw a breakdown of the current ceasefire in Idlib. So much is at stake, and the important thing now is to try to use this opportunity and to break the deadlock.
Thank you so much. This makes a lot of sense, and I agree with a lot of it. If I may just follow up on one thing, since you ended on Idlib, and one of the conversations that we also have been having quite a bit is how can the international community incentivize behavioral change, not only from Damascus, but also from the other actors, some of which you said are impossible to be included in a UN-backed process, others maybe, but absent their inclusion or short of their inclusion in a peace process, is there a way for the international community to try to get Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the YPG, some of the Turkish-backed Syrian factions to change their behavior vis-a-vis the populations they're currently ruling over? And that is a question to both of you. So I would start with you, Stefan. Do you think the Europeans have leverage over some of these parties?
Well, let's say you mean both the Kurdish part and the Idlib, let's say,
Yes.
the two sides. There are nowadays, these contacts are quite rare in a sense. As you know, it's one of the main issues we face in the dialogue with Turkey concerning the northeast. At the same time, the Europeans are, let's say, heavily investing in assistance to the northeast under the anti-Daesh coalition stabilization effort. Also, Italy is actively engaged in that part of Syria, the part liberated from Daesh, with the aim of avoiding a new chances of recruitment. And this, in particular in this area, we have a huge problem of the so-called refugee or detention camps, Al-Hol and similar, which are already, I wouldn't say risk becoming a huge black hole with thousands of people, families connected to the Daesh people in detention. And many projects are going on around this issue in order to empty, let's say, or let's say diminish the pressure coming from this part. So let's say that in operational terms, we are very actively in this area, not politically, with the local authorities for the reasons I mentioned. As for Idlib, let's say we know it's a completely different matter, and the issue there is basically to ensure the cross-border. Now, this is the main goal of the European activity, to support this cross-border, which every year becomes a nightmare. Apparently now things are going a bit better, also thanks to these contacts between Americans and Russians, which are quite intense. And also because the cross-line operation are improving. So let's say it's a positive moment under this respect. But of course, it's always a potential time bomb. We know we have 3 million people depending from external aid, which comes basically through this cross-border. So it remains highly sensitive.
Thank you. Gareth, as you know, I personally engage with the HTS leadership, with the SDF leadership, and also with the Turkish-backed factions. And I constantly get asked the same question from all these parties. What can we do in order to be better perceived by the international community, but also by you personally? There's a lot of questions about how can we be better perceived by the UN Special Envoy. Do you think that this is an area where you and your colleagues could potentially engage in?
Sorry. No, I'm afraid, Darine, that I would have to go back to the way I answered this question previously, and that is with a reference to what indeed is my mandate, and which is sort of the agreed resolution by the Security Council on how to move the political process. Then I, of course, also understand that we need to address the issues of the Northeast and how to deal with that, and you will not be able to move forward towards, hopefully when the day comes, when we will start to discuss what I will call the end game in Syria. That will have to be part of the solution. That goes without saying. That is in the interest of Syria itself, and that would of course also be in the interest of Turkey. When it comes to the HTS, I'm afraid there, I have nothing new to add to what I already told you.
Right. Gary, you've mentioned briefly about a new creative reciprocal process, and I don't know how much you can share with us about the thinking and what kind of concrete and realistic steps are you envisioning in the process?
No, I'm afraid not. I try to be a bit careful, sort of not to prejudge even the start of the discussion in this. And my hope is it may be a bit naive at this stage, but anyway, it's my hope that it should be possible to establish a bit of ownership from the key international players in this, and that they will have to engage seriously in defining, what they are prepared to put on the table, what they expect of the others, but both things need to be done. And what I'm hoping to avoid is what I call the eternal sort of you first. Let the other side decide what they can put on the table, and then we will put something on the table. I've been trying to promote this approach now for quite a while. The good news is that I feel that there is a willingness from all key interlocutors to engage with me in a discussion on this. And I had actually hoped to be able to start this month, but we have had some practical challenges because of COVID. So we will see, when we will be able to start the process. Of course, I also realize that this will take time, but my hope is that we will be able to start a process that can start to show, gives a little bit of hope and build a little bit of trust, so that we can enter into all these other issues that we have also discussed today.
Thank you so much. It's always great to hear good news and different parties' willingness to engage in talks. So this is, it's very positive to hear. Stefano, back to you. And shifting the conversation a little bit, because it's very difficult to have a conversation about Syria without mentioning ISIS. Today, the ISIS threat has increasingly diminished, yet we still see attacks in northeastern Syria and in government-held parts of Syria as well. Additionally, there are hundreds of European citizens detained in SDF-controlled facilities, along with their families and often kids. If you can tell us a little bit about Italy's approach towards repatriation of some of their citizens in northeast Syria and engaging with the SDF on that matter.
Sure. Well, my second assignment is anti-Daesh coalition, so I'm well prepared. Let's say our approach is what we call case-by-case approach. In a sense, it's easier for us as in terms of number. The Italians or the owners of Italian citizenship in between the camps were very limited. We're talking about 3 people now. So the approach is in favor of repatriation. Each repatriation case by case, in the sense that each one is well prepared in terms of also judicial activity, because the problem basically is to repatriate someone which could be a danger, let's say, for society. So, of course, the case is studied in terms of family links, activities, whatever, and as soon as the person is repatriated, is under investigation. Now, the issue is is usually always discussed within the coalition, because as you know, there are other countries, in particular, our European countries, with many foreign fighters, terrorists in these camps. And of course, to them, it's a major problem to imagine a massive repatriation. Well, but let's say the tendency is common in favor of repatriation. Recently, Germany and Denmark repatriated not only children, minors, which was, let's say, an accepted rule in a sense, but with the mothers as well. Of course, we're talking about 20, about 10, but slowly, at least the goal would be to empty the, let's say, foreign fighters part of the camps, the annex, famous annex. Of course, the Americans are very supportive in these activities because in order to reach the place, we need to have the logistical support. So let's say the tendency is consolidating. Of course, there are still other non-European countries with citizens in these camps. They don't want their citizens back, and they're asking for international tribunals, whatever, which are quite difficult to establish. Another positive element is Iraq's position. Now they're moving also. Recently, they got back 500, so quite a relevant number. But still, we have 60,000. So numbers are high, but at least let's say the willingness is quite evident now.
That's really good to hear that there's increasing willingness to repatriate citizens. Okay, we have 8 more minutes. So I'll turn to you, Gareth, if you could, and you already touched upon this, but if you can just recap really quickly in 4 minutes, if you would offer specific asks from the EU and from the US on means for them to support the political process and to support the efforts that you're currently undergoing and that you're also pursuing in the near future, what would these specific asks be?
Thank you, Darina. You know, I think what of course strikes us all, I believe, is that when we now follow the Syrian crisis, we understand for obvious reasons that after 10 years or nearly 11 years of conflict, this is no longer, of course, a first priority or even the second, third, or fourth, or fifth when you are talking to Americans or even to Europeans. But of course, for in particular our Arab friends and for the neighbors, this is an issue that is increasingly becoming unsustainable. They need to see action soon. And of course, it's still a key priority from Turkey, from Iran, and in Moscow. So there is what I would call, a little bit what I could say a little bit of an unbalance here. So I think so that's why I said, I understand, and you can't change that reality. But I think if they are willing to engage, as they now have told me that they are, in what we're doing in the step-for-step process, and also when it comes to developing the humanitarian assistance, work on early recovery and resilience, and then, as I said, working on all of these things together, I think we could see a new beginning for Syria. But it's extremely important for me to emphasize that we need, all the players, because as I said before, none of them can dictate the outcome of this conflict. So, for Russia, for Iran, and for Turkey, sort of the 3 key actors on the ground, they understand this and they accept this. And of course, it goes without saying that the United States cannot, and the European Union cannot, and the Arabs cannot. So what we need is then a willingness to sit down, to discuss, as I said before, the realities that are there, and try to build trust and move the process forward. This, of course, would require, some investments, more investments, political investments from the United States, and from Europe. And I've told my European friends that I indeed think that, of course, the fact that the terrorist threat is not eliminated, Daesh still roaming around in Syria. And there are many who are telling me that even the threat from Daesh has been increasing the last few months. This is obviously an issue of great importance to Europe. And then we have, of course, the unresolved situation in Idlib, with more than 1.5 million IDPs. And this, of course, is also a potential challenge, not only for the Syrians themselves, for Turkey, but also for Europe. So all of this, I think, should serve as a reminder of the importance that we cannot let this conflict continue to linger as it has. We need new initiatives. We need new serious discussions. We need diplomacy to start to work. And, let me be honest, so far the political process has not delivered to the Syrian people. So that's why, I also saying that, let's also be honest in saying that if we leave this to the Syrian parties alone, we will not be able to find a solution to the crisis. So there is a huge responsibility also for the international community to come together and start to work seriously on this issue. Thank you, Darin.
Absolutely. Stefano Ger said that all parties need to sit down, rethink the new realities, and be willing to invest. Do you think the EU is willing to sit down, question their pre-assessment, accept the new reality, and invest?
Well, let's say when we talk among Europeans, there's a general feeling that the reality should be taken into consideration as it is now. Of course, the red lines, we know, you mentioned them, reconstruction and normalization, whatever are there. But I'm sure that through channels like the early recovery, there is a chance to engage to engage more concretely on the ground. Let's say to transform this narrative with the European one, which is perceived that many times is on the negative. No, it's sanctions, it's no, to the positive. No, meaning we are ready to do, including reconstruction, if to send this message, because we know, for example, sanctions are used by Damascus and the Russians to blame the EU and to put the responsibility for the economic crisis on the EU, which of course we dismiss as such. But in terms of communication, probably we can do better. This I would agree, and I would also mention the step for step. For sure, we should engage a bit more in putting some content. Now, the principle step for step is fantastic. It's not something new in diplomacy, but we should help Ger in this case in with concrete ideas. What we are also ready to deliver, and of course what we expect. I like a lot the concept of parallelism, no? Because otherwise we always fall in this, yes, but he doesn't do better. No, parallelism is something which hopefully could work.
I'm really glad we had at least one Syria panel where there is a sense of positivity, a sense that there is things that could be done and are being done. So I'm going to end on this very positive note. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Gareth, it's always a pleasure to see you, even virtually. Stefano, it's likewise a huge pleasure.
Yes, please do. There is a lot of